I'm going to share with you a few musings on the year of 2026 from an astrological perspective. 2025 was certainly a very significant year. I expect 2026 is going to continue a lot of the trends that were established in 2025. In fact, it may even end up being, in some respects, more dramatic at certain times. And we really need to talk about the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which has already been discussed by many astrologers in 2025, including myself. Though the thing is that in 2025, although Saturn and Neptune came very close to forming an exact conjunction, they didn't quite perfect it. And the exact conjunction is going to occur on the 20th of February of this year. Now, although Saturn and Neptune didn't form an exact conjunction in 2025, I dare say they came close enough to have produced an effect, so to speak, or I believe we've already seen some of the manifestations of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in 2025. But it's important to note that that story is not over, and that we are now fast approaching the actual exact conjunction. Now, the thing is, with this kind of major conjunction of slow-moving planets, the not only do you see effects around the time that they occur, but they can bring about events that, have consequences for years to come, and sometimes, in fact, you only really see clearly what their significance has been after some time has passed. Another thing that should be borne in mind is that there are certain astrological events that have the effect of amplifying whatever's going on in the heavens at that time for quite a long time thereafter. And I'm thinking here specifically about eclipses, for one, as well as solar ingresses. Now, in that regard, I'm thinking of the chart when the sun enters Aries in the tropical zodiac, basically a chart for the northern hemisphere's vernal equinox, generally 20th, 21st of March every year, but then also when the sun enters the other cardinal points in the zodiac. In other words, at all the solstices and equinoxes, you also get a type of amplification of whatever's going on there. And so during 2025, we already had a number of these events where this developing Saturn-Neptune conjunction was brought into sharp focus by ingress charts and eclipses. Now, one of the things that makes this particular Saturn-Neptune conjunction, I would say, stand out from the rest is the fact that it occurs at the first degree of Aries. And that first degree of Aries is a sensitive point in the zodiac, precisely because that is the place where the equinox occurs. And it could be said that this first degree of Aries is something like the world's ascendant. It's somewhat comparable to the way in which the ascendant is a sort of an all-important sensitive point in the birth chart of an individual. In a comparable way, that first degree of Aries is a globally significant sensitive point. And so when important astrological events occur at the first degree of Aries, and to some extent also at the first degree of Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn, those astrological events tend to get amplified a great deal, and they have a more global significance than would otherwise have been the case, and they, you might say, sort of permeate more fully into the entire zeitgeist than would otherwise have been the case. And so although we have Saturn-Neptune conjunctions every roughly 35-ish years or so, and that alone would make the Saturn-Neptune conjunction notable. This one, I think, it should be viewed as one that is much more consequential. And interestingly enough, on the very day that the exact Saturn-Neptune conjunction occurs, the moon happens to be in the same sign, which seems to be further amplifying its importance. But yeah, you know, we've still got a ways to go yet with this Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Now, you know, the question is, what does it mean really? What is the Saturn-Neptune conjunction all about? You know, at the time of the last Saturn-Neptune conjunction in 1989, we had the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and that is a pretty good symbolic description of what Saturn and Neptune does. If Saturn is structures, like a literal figure of wall, Neptune is that which could make it crumble and dissolve. You know, Saturn is about everything that is very concrete and very structured, whereas Neptune blurs the boundaries between things. Neptune causes things to literally dissolve and become much more sort of diffused and vague and even somewhat veiled. And so when we have Saturn Neptune conjunctions, things become very murky. And there's a sort of a general sense of things that used to be very well defined, very well structured, you know, becoming sort of vulnerable and becoming less coherent and ordered. And so I believe that in 2025 we've already seen a kind of sense of everything becoming very disorganized. One of the many ways this is manifested has been through Trump upending the trade systems that had been well established in the world with his tariffs, and there has been just generally a sense of the entire system that runs the world. You know, the organizations and structures and all of that keep things functional becoming, you know, chaotic. And you know, it's been now several months that I think everyone is feeling that you just don't know what's going on anymore. You know, there's a global sense of the masses, the common people, struggling to, you know, put food on the table. You know, there's this affordability crisis all over the world, and you know, in terms of the so-called rules-based order that governs international politics, all of that seems to have been thrown completely out the window. There just aren't any real norms and rules anymore. And, you know, we can see here at the time of the Aries ingress in 2026 that the Saturn-Neptune conjunction is still, you know, not even a whole 3 degrees from exact. And they're both close to the sun at the time. So even this coming Aries ingress, the chart for that equinox moment is considered to reflect global trends for the year ahead. So apart from the actual Saturn-Neptune conjunction coming in February, we also have a sort of reaffirmation of its significance for the entire year ahead at the time of the Aries ingress, arguably into 2027. Now, here is an excerpt from the overview of 2025 that I wrote for the Regulus 2025 astrological planner that Paola Bellamini and myself brought out. I wrote here that speaking of oceans, legend has it that Neptune presides over that realm, and in the context of this coming Saturn-Neptune conjunction, there could be some sort of maritime situation, dirty or unruly waters, water supply disruption and floods, some problems at sea perhaps. The partial solar eclipse of 21 September occurs in close opposition to Saturn and Neptune, and this may well turn out to be one of the most important and potent amplifications of the Saturn-Neptune process that plays such a dominant role in the year 2025. Now, this was written probably around November of 2024, and it's interesting to reflect on just how much drama there has been, in the world's oceans. Also, it was it March or April of 2025 that there was a conflict between India and Pakistan, which was all about water supply. And we've had the Houthis of Yemen blocking shipping there in response to what's been happening in Gaza. And also, very dramatically, we've seen what many have termed literal piracy occurring off the coast of Venezuela, with the USA, bombing boats that were allegedly trafficking drugs. There's been a confiscation of oil tankers and all of that sort of thing. And I think we might yet see more of this. It's worth bearing in mind that in terms of the sidereal zodiac, this Saturn-Neptune conjunction actually occurs in the sign Pisces, which is connected to the oceans, and Neptune itself has the bearing on that theme. Now, the eclipse of September 2025 is important because although that is now behind us, the fact is that when it comes to eclipses, there's often a lot of curiosity about them, a lot of anticipation about what they might bring about. But the fact is that one often has to wait weeks, if not months, before the implications of an eclipse occurring really become apparent. That said, it could be argued also that eclipses have some effect even before they occur, and so sometimes even prior to them occurring, you can already see, them casting their shadows before, so to speak. But what is particularly notable is that once an eclipse has occurred, transits that occur to the eclipse chart, and in particular to the actual degree of the eclipse, will often activate that eclipse. Now, with this in mind, although this eclipse is behind us, it is still an active chart, you might say. Its impact will certainly be present and significant into 2026. And one of the things that made the solar eclipse of 2025 so conspicuous as well on the one hand, the fact that the eclipse occurred opposite the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, bringing that into sharp focus. But there was also a square of Mars and Pluto, which is really a very sort of aggressive signature. And I have elsewhere in other videos and posts, social media, noted some of the ways this eclipse has been triggered by transits subsequent to its occurrence in particular locations. So, for example, the massacre in Sydney is one example where the eclipse was literally on the ascendant and in that location, and on the 14th of December, transiting Mars, was squaring that eclipse degree, as well as the Saturn and Neptune placements at the time of the eclipse. And with that in mind, I wouldn't be surprised if about a week or so into April of 2026, when Mars literally opposes the eclipse degree and is conjunct Saturn and Neptune's placement at the time of the eclipse, when we might have another significant event, particularly in locations where the eclipse was either on the horizon axis or on the midheaven, or forming 90-degree angles to those sensitive angles. Another time to note is round about, I don't know, the 20th to 23rd, 4th or so of January of 2026, when the Sun and Mars will be conjunct Pluto's position in that eclipse chart, and also squaring Mars in the eclipse chart. But even without reference to that September eclipse, just merely the fact that we have the Sun, Mars, and Pluto all coming together about 2/3 of the way through January of 2026, that alone makes it a time to watch. At the time of the attack by Hamas on Israel on the 7th of October, Mars and Pluto were forming a square aspect to each other, and just hard aspects between Mars and Pluto occurring in the heavens by themselves without any other amplifying factors can be enough to bring about very explosive events. So this is a bit of a red flag moment here, as we get close to the latter part of January of 2026. Then we have a solar eclipse occurring on the 17th of February. And what is interesting here is that eclipse is going to be square Uranus. And that alone is enough to make it high voltage, you might say. The planet Uranus was specifically associated with technology, also with aviation, often. I don't know if this is therefore going to bring about some massive, technological failure around the time of the eclipse, or some aviation incident, perhaps, or possibly, the general tendency of the planet Uranus to be very willful and rebellious could manifest. Perhaps there's going to be a certain amount of, unrest as people sort of assert their autonomy. Now, this is a chart for that eclipse for London, and it's interesting that it occurs quite close to the midheaven, and then you obviously have Uranus squaring the midheaven, and so it could be that London will and the UK more generally will see some dramatic manifestations of this eclipse. It's also interesting that Saturn and Neptune are square the ascendant fairly closely, and so there could be some unscheduled change of leadership, which is not that uncommon in the UK. Keir Starmer's position is very delicate. He's very unpopular, and there's been a lot of talk about various people in his party scheming to overthrow him. So that is one of the possible themes that could come up, particularly for the UK and for London. And now, on a more general level, again, remembering that eclipses often reveal their hand when they get triggered by transits. We can see here they're transiting Mars, or Mars rather, at the time of the eclipse is some 9 degrees behind the actual eclipse. And so when Mars reaches the degree of that eclipse and then also squares Uranus, we could find that will be one of the times when this eclipse gets sort of stirred into a manifestation, and that will occur around the very end of February, the last day or two of February, and perhaps the first day or so of March of 2026. So on the one hand, I would expect that could be globally a time where there could be some very dramatic incidents, accidents, perhaps some aviation incidents, and again, it might be that London or the UK generally will be one of the areas that could be affected. And it is interesting that there's another solar eclipse later in the year, on the 12th of August, that squares the midheaven rather in the UK, in London more particularly. So it does look like there can be some pretty cathartic events happening in the UK and London more specifically in the months ahead. Now, this eclipse also seems to be quite consequential for Trump. It happens to occur quite closely opposite his ascendant and Mars, with Uranus being square his Mars and his ascendant. And I would even go as far as to say that this could be quite dangerous for him. There have already been assassination attempts in the past, and the time he got shot in the ear, Mars and Uranus were forming a conjunction close to his midheaven. It could be that he simply finds himself having to fend off many challenges from others, whether that's within the USA and within the political scene or on a more international stage. But with that eclipse being opposite his Mars, there's definitely a pretty aggressive energy there, and I would be a little concerned that he could be somewhat more impulsive or reckless than usual. And as it is, there's almost no telling what he will be doing or saying from one day to the next. And the fact that eclipse is close to the ascendant in Washington adds, I believe, a further layer of concern or alert, if you like, for the USA in general and for Trump in particular. And again, especially when we get to the end of February and early March. Now, the reason I've got two charts here is, well, it's a little bit of a academic point really, but one of my colleagues and I have been debating whether one is correct in using the moment of the actual maximum eclipse or the full moon moment, or new moon moment, as the case may be, for whichever eclipse it is. Whichever way we look at it, the ascendant occurs pretty close to, so the eclipse occurs pretty close to the ascendant. It happens to be very exactly on the ascendant for the new moon moment. I'm not going to get into too much of the technicalities around why there could be these two options. It, in this case, makes a difference of 10 minutes, which shifts the ascendant just a few degrees. But either which way, I think that there could be some pretty dramatic events happening in the USA, and particularly in Washington, before too long. Now, we're going to have a Mars-Saturn conjunction on the 19th of April. And this is by itself quite a potent astrological event. And it's quite a frustrated and arguably quite a destructive sort of energy. And over the years, I've seen many cases of even in relatively calm and peaceful times, you'd have countries testing ballistic missiles and things like that, and causing everybody to be flustered and upset about it. But in 2024, we had a Mars-Saturn conjunction in April, and it was at that time that there was some conflict between Israel and Iran sent over a bunch of missiles, and more of a show of force, really. It wasn't quite as intense as the 12-day war, and I'm not going to go into all of the astrology behind that, although that is very interesting. Mars was on the ascendant in Tehran in the 2025 Aries ingress chart, but again, that's another story. But I'm mentioning that about this last Mars-Saturn conjunction just to illustrate how, by itself, without any ingresses, eclipses, or anything else to amplify them, Mars-Saturn conjunctions can be a time when any sort of conflicts that are simmering can reach a sort of boiling point. I find it interesting that at the time of this Mars-Saturn conjunction, Mercury is very close to pretty much exactly conjunct this Mars-Saturn conjunction, which might mean that there is a very, should we say, sort of verbal or information-based expression of it. I can't help thinking about the fact that Mercury was conjunct Saturn and Pluto when they formed their last conjunction in January of 2020. And I think that fact has often been overlooked because it seems to me to describe that we were at that time entering a new era, if you like, of narrative control, news control, speech control, censorship, and so on. And so it is possible that kind of use of information or control of speech or something like this could be part of what this Mars-Saturn conjunction with Mercury represents. Mercury is also associated with students, educational institutions, messengers, I suppose journalists, young people. So I don't know, maybe there will be attacks on schools or young people, something along those lines. Maybe young people will become very militant. I don't know. There's lots of, often with astrology, we have lots of different possible ways things can manifest, and we might sometimes ask ourselves, like, which one of these many ways in which something might manifest will end up, being the case. But it's often all of them or several of them, rather than it necessarily being just one of the possible manifestations that actually occur. In fact, what's interesting is that this Mercury-Mars conjunction with Saturn is the third in a series of conjunctions that occur because of Mercury going retrograde. The first one occurs in January, around the 17th of January, and we then have another one in March, just around the middle of March, just before the middle of March, and then finally at the time of the Mars-Saturn conjunction. And so these dates I've just mentioned with these other Mercury-Mars conjunctions, I'll just be kind of curious to see what happens at those times. There could be some sort of prelude to the last conjunction. This is just a little observation, a little curious fact. Now, some weeks ago, in a astrology group I'm part of that meets weekly, somebody just incidentally brought up NATO and the chart of NATO, and as they were mentioning some of the key placements, I found myself suddenly thinking, oh goodness gracious me, this does not bode well. Particularly the fact that the Sun and Mars in the chart of NATO occupy tropical Aries, and the fact that we're going to be having Saturn moving through Aries and crossing over that Mars and Sun in the coming months. And in light of all the steadily escalating tension between NATO and Russia in particular, this is a little worrying. Now, when it comes to astrological charts for organizations like this, I believe that they're valid in theory. I'm always a little cautious about making any great predictions or assuming that these charts will be as responsive as one would expect. And so one of the ways I would try to validate that a chart for an organization or entity of this kind is effective and responsive is by looking at whether or not previous transiting triggers to it have yielded what you would have expected them to do. Now, before I go into one or two examples that I believe suggest that this chart for NATO is indeed one that's worth taking seriously, we should note that at the time of this coming Mars-Saturn conjunction in April, it's occurring very close to where Mercury was in NATO's chart, but just days later, NATO will have a Mars return, and then Mars will cross over NATO's Sun, and in the weeks that follow and months that follow, Saturn will cross over Mars and then station on the Sun in this chart for NATO. And so this is looking a little dangerous. This graphic ephemeris here shows how transiting Saturn will cross over NATO's Mars in May and then station around the middle of the year, conjunct the Sun, and then in October, once again, form a conjunction with Mars, and then late January, February 2027, again, we have a conjunction to Mars. So we're going to have a series of triggers here from transiting Saturn to this, the Sun and Mars. And of course, the mere fact that the Sun and Mars are in something of a conjunction in NATO's chart is very fitting, showing it to be a type of military alliance. Now, this to me is the most striking fact, and that is that half a Saturn cycle ago was when NATO invaded Libya. And the interesting thing is that that invasion of Libya was initially orchestrated by some NATO members, but it was eventually formally taken over by and run by, executed by NATO. And now we have this sort of very comparable event occurring in the months ahead. Now, this chart here shows in 2011 that literally Saturn was stationing on Mars in the natal chart of NATO during the very period of that Libyan invasion's most intense, manifestation, that when the conflict was most active. And that is, as I see it, a pretty strong validation of that chart. Now, when it comes to determining the ascendant of such an organization, it's a far more delicate thing than just agreeing or arriving at a consensus about the relevant date. But the best information I have is that it was around 4 p.m. Of that, on the 4th of April 1949, that the actual treaty was signed. And this yields an ascendant of 14 tropical Virgo, with the midheaven at 12 Gemini. And what is interesting is that the only time that Article 5 was triggered, Article 5 being that clause in NATO that states that an attack on one is an attack on all, and that when Article 5 is triggered, all NATO member states are obliged to come to the defense of, the injured party. And so basically, the day after the 9/11 attacks, essentially Article 5 was triggered. And what is interesting is that at this time, transiting Saturn was exactly square the ascendant, transiting Pluto was exactly opposite the midheaven to the degree. Maybe that's just a coincidence, but for what it's worth, it does seem to be another, not just a validation of the day, but potentially that the time of this chart of 4 p.m. is correct. But I'm willing to take this as just speculative. Another curious fact is that Putin's sun, we've got Putin's chart on the inner wheel. The middle wheel is the chart for NATO, and the outer wheel is the transits for the time when Saturn is about to change direction from direct to retrograde in July of 2026. Now, you may or may not buy into synastry between individuals and organizations, but for what it's worth, Putin and NATO certainly have a long-standing mutual, disdain, if you like, and suspicion and conflict. And so basically it's interesting to see that their suns are opposite each other. But even if we remove that layer of thinking here, the mere fact that transiting Saturn is going to be opposite Putin's sun and conjunct NATO's sun does mean that both of these entities separately or in relation to each other, are undergoing some very important process and very strenuous process around the middle of 2026. The fact that Putin's going to be having Saturn opposite his Sun, that by itself can mean that he is going to be quite exhausted. It could be somewhat dangerous for him. His health might suffer, and or he may have to contend with a lot of criticism and challenges to his political position. Now, when you have hard aspects from translating Saturn to the natal Sun in the chart of an individual, it shouldn't be assumed that failure is inevitable. Although it wasn't very exact at the time, Trump was having loosely a Saturn-Sun opposition at the time of his first presidential victory. And so, sometimes it indicates a time of intense pressure, but some, the potential to emerge from that test, vindicated and victorious. But it is a delicate time, and for some people it will be a meaningful defeat. So we can't really know which way it's going to go here for Putin, but what we can tell, assuming he was born on the 7th of October 1952, or I know because that is disputed by some, but assuming that's the case, then he is coming up for a very critical time. Saturn crossing over NATO's Sun, I don't know. NATO as an organization is also in quite a delicate phase, with Trump being quite hot and cold about NATO, often criticizing NATO quite openly, even to some extent questioning its relevance and so on. So there could even be something of an existential crisis for NATO described in the Saturn-Sun conjunction. But the fact that it's mixed up with a Saturn-Mars conjunction means that it's not going to be without some sort of fight, literally or figuratively. Okay, now, on another note entirely, we have a very interesting astrological event occurring in July of 2026. Jupiter and all the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, are all coming into this very precise geometric configuration, all of them at 4 degrees of their respective signs in the tropical zodiac. And it's quite difficult to give this an interpretation because there's so many planets involved. There's, we could probably break it up into a number of different separate little interpretations for each of the different aspects involved. First and foremost, we have a Jupiter-Pluto opposition, which is arguably the primary feature of this configuration, but we also have a Jupiter-Uranus sextile, a Jupiter-Neptune trine, we have a Neptune-Pluto sextile, we have a Uranus-Neptune sextile, we have a Uranus-Pluto trine. Each one of these separate components contributes something to the picture, but in a situation like this, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and so apart from all of these separate elements having their own significance, the whole thing acts as one greater complex. Now, one of the things that's important about this astrological event is that it's the halfway mark in the Jupiter-Pluto synodic cycle, and the conjunction, or the beginning of the current Jupiter-Pluto cycle, occurred in 2020. And that coincided with the whole world essentially going into lockdown. It was right in the beginning of April of 2020 that this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction occurred. And so, in every cycle, The opposition point is a time of revelation, you might say. It's a time of things, it's almost like you could almost call it the full moon moment. The full moon is the opposition point in the lunar cycle that begins at the new moon. So it's like a time of sort of fullness and ripening of whatever that cycle represents. And when you combine Jupiter and Pluto, you have this theme of an almost sort of fanatical ideology, or a fanatical belief system, perhaps. But it can also manifest as heavy-handed law. And the way the lockdowns were, a case of you will stay home, like it or not, for your own good. It's not negotiable, and you will be punished if you disobey. It's a sort of a mixture of benign protective intentions, but with a very coercive tone and texture to it. And on another level, what we had in 2020 around that time, inevitably coinciding with the lockdowns, was the need to open the bank vault, so to speak, and there had to be a provision of money to make all of this possible, and many people greedily took advantage of this in an opportunistic way, and people who were well connected made vast sums of money by seizing the opportunity. Now, it may not be exactly the same story that occurs in July, but again, we could have some of the same core principles at work, some manifestation of a very heavy-handed wielding of legal authority, and a sort of molding of social, of society, and even in sort of an imposing of certain values or ideals upon people. There can also then be a very strong countering of this, a very strong resistance to this. The fact that Uranus and Neptune are involved is of course complicating this picture. Now, the planet Uranus has a lot to do with technology, for one. Neptune often makes things a little bit less transparent than might otherwise have been the case. Even just the Uranus-Pluto trine by itself, which is part of a broader pattern that we're going to be seeing manifesting over the next year or two, I believe can be associated with this sort of movement towards things like digital ID, the sort of digifying, so to speak, of society, in ways that are quite sort of controlling. Where we also in 2020 had the vaccine passports, almost being like a precursor to this idea of having a lot of your information stored and making your access to very basic things in society, conditional to you doing as you're told. Maybe with the Neptune involved, this could be done perhaps by stealth at that time, in some way. There's lots of other ways this could play out, and I think it is going to manifest on several different levels. And I think for people who have planets in their natal charts at 4 degrees or fixed signs in particular, I think that's going to be a very powerful and important time for them. And for some of them, it might in fact be very empowering. Jupiter combining with Pluto can bring a person wealth, influence, power. And when it's wielded for a suitably just and legitimate purpose, it can do a lot of good. But there is an element of sort of might makes right that comes with this. So I think this is going to be an important time. And here we can see a graphic ephemeris depiction of this convergence of all of these planets at that time. It's quite a unique event, and this is simply showing that on the 19th and 21st the moon will at certain particular hours form more complex pictures on top of that basic structure. Now, on the 12th of August, we have a total solar eclipse, and it occurs somewhere between Iceland and Greenland. And so that area might be broadly worth watching at that time. Of course, this is quite interesting in light of the fact that Trump has declared that he wants Greenland and that they must have it for national security reasons or whatever it is. And I don't know if that's going to be what plays out there. I also can't help thinking about the fact that Iceland is quite prone to having significant volcanic eruptions. There could be an amplification of that. I did look at the chart for this eclipse for the location of the capital of Greenland. I believe it's a town called Nuuk, N-U-U-K. If I'm not mistaken, that had Jupiter on the midheaven and the eclipse squaring the ascendant, more or less. It doesn't look too disastrous, but maybe they managed to assert their autonomy, or some other significant event occurs in relation to the sort of sovereign status of Greenland. Now, this is a chart for that eclipse using a sort of neutral wheel. So what I mean by that is it's not anchored to any particular location, it's just putting sort of areas where the first house usually is, just to look at the broader pattern. And this is using the sidereal zodiac. That eclipse occurs in tropical Leo, but it happens to be in Cancer in the sidereal zodiac, and it occurs not too far from Jupiter. And I think this is potentially a good omen, not only because of the way Jupiter is brought into focus here, but because Jupiter is exalted. The moon, incidentally, also occupies her own sign here. But particularly the exaltation of Jupiter is something that I interpret as an awareness of the or honoring of the sanctity of life and the desire to protect and nurture the vulnerable. And and so there's a certain, let's call it, humane quality, not only about Jupiter generally, but particularly when it's in its exaltation sign Cancer. And so I'm not sure if it's going to play out this way, but it could be that this eclipse points to some just, humane, noble values or principles being, brought into focus, becoming more predominant in the world, possibly leading to wise, well-intentioned people being heard, getting to guide the direction of events. Maybe there could be resolutions to conflicts, perhaps some sort of healing and restitution for those who've suffered. And again, bearing in mind that eclipses get activated by transits, we might want to keep an eye on when transiting Jupiter actually crosses that eclipse degree, which will occur around about the early part of October, maybe end of September, early October time of 2026. And it so happens that Jupiter will then go retrograde just before the middle of December of 2026, and once again cross over that eclipse degree in February of 2027, and even one more time at the very end of May, early June 2027. So there will actually be three exact hits, if you like, from transiting Jupiter to that eclipse degree in the weeks and months that follow it. And so, maybe there will be a series of events that maybe bring about some renewal of hope in the world. This may not occur in a vacuum, so to speak, and there could be, in parallel to this, some unresolved conflicts. I'm particularly aware of the fact that transiting Saturn will, after the conjunction with Mars in April, it will go retrograde and once again be conjunct that that 7 degrees Aries point where the Mars-Saturn conjunction occurs in December of 2026. So maybe December 2026 could be another intense phase of conflict in some form, and then again in late January, February 2027, we've got Saturn crossing over NATO's Mars again, and so on. And so there could be a time where they're in the latter part of 2026 and early 2027 when you have a sort of parallel process of some unresolved conflict still simmering, but with a somewhat improved dominant narrative, for want of a better way of putting it. Well, maybe that is wishful thinking, but we probably need a little bit of wishful thinking at this time in the world. I think so. I'm going to leave it there and just conclude by wishing for all of you as much equanimity as you can muster in 2026 and early 2027. I think it's an important thing to remember that even when we as the little people aren't really able to do much about the state of the world and the consequential decisions of our leaders, we could arguably end up becoming part of the problem rather than the solution if we give way to anger and despair. And so we should all try to find ways in which we can find a way to blossom individually within these crazy times.